Last month, I travelled to Oslo, Norway to attend the Oslo Freedom Forum. This is an event that's been run every year for the last decade or so by the Human Rights Foundation, and it brings together experts from fields such as technology and journalism, with freedom fighters, activists and dissidents from around the globe to discuss some of the most pressing human rights issues that are taking place today, to talk about how we can tackle those issues, and also to celebrate some of the small victories that have been made by the incredible people there in bringing greater freedom and human dignity to the world. So why was I there? I'm not an expert in anything, and I'm not an activist or a freedom fighter either. Well, I was interested in learning what this was all about, and I was particularly interested in seeing how technology fits into all of it. Both how can technology be weaponized and used to control, to track and censor people, but also how can technology, and especially decentralized technologies like Bitcoin, be used to counter that, to increase people's freedoms. Those ideas were definitely touched on throughout the 3-day event, but so were so many other things, so many other topics. And in this video, I want to talk about some of those, to highlight some of the main takeaways from different parts of it, and again, particularly looking at the intersection of all of these human rights issues with things like Bitcoin. Obviously, there was so much that went on in the incredible event. I won't be able to do real justice to it here, so I'll put links down below to the Oslo Freedom Forum website, to the Human Rights Foundation website, and also to their YouTube channel, so if you want, you can go ahead and watch in full most of the sessions that I'll be talking about here. The event was really kicked off with a talk by Thor Halvorsen, who is the Human Rights Foundation's president and the founder of the Oslo Freedom Forum. And he really set the scene for the next few days' events, talking about the dangers of authoritarianism and the impacts of it around the world, giving some pretty devastating statistics about it.
We're looking at, in the colored section, all sorts of authoritarian governments. Some of them are theocracies, some of them are secular dictatorships, some of them are military dictatorships, some of them are absolute monarchies. What they all have in common, regardless of whether they have a sham election or they talk about individual rights or even talk about climate change, what they all have in common is that they lack individual rights. That's 4.1 billion people, more than half of the world's population, 53% to be exact, in 94 countries. Consider that 96% of the world's refugees come from authoritarian countries. What that should tell you is that people don't flee from countries that are free. 96%. 25 out of the 30 poorest countries in the world are run by authoritarian regimes. 18 of the countries that have of the 20 countries that have the worst possible access to drinking water are authoritarian regimes. And the one that's really makes people's heads spin is the fact that all 28 military conflicts in the world, 25 authoritarian governments involved in them, and in 3 cases, it's authoritarian ideology that have taken hold of a certain sector of a country that is not authoritarian. The challenge is on us to resolve these things by addressing them as authoritarian, as problems of authoritarianism. It isn't be against war, it's be against authoritarianism. It isn't let's find the solution to bring clean water, it's let's address the issue of authoritarianism. And then once they have a government that is accountable to the people, then we will see a solution come a lot faster.
He went on to refer to China as the largest tyranny in the world, citing its international and domestic attempts to restrict and impose censorship on people, likening the surveillance state there to the dystopian worlds described in cautionary tales of the past.
If you want to consider the admonitions and the warnings given by George Orwell and by Aldous Huxley in Brave New World and Orwell's 1984, these are supposed to be warnings, yet the regime of China has apparently chosen them as an operating manual, as a handbook, to do what they do.
This brief mention of China was a really good setup for the first of the proper talks of the event, and one that I thought was one of the most fascinating and concerning of the entire thing. It was called China's Cultural Genocide and was presented by Nuri Turkel, a US-based Uyghur rights activist. He was talking all about China's attempt to essentially eliminate an entire cultural group from their population, using sophisticated surveillance techniques to monitor and control activities, and massive internment camps to imprison and brainwash millions of people who don't comply with what the Chinese state wants them to do.
Cities, towns, villages are blanketed with surveillance cameras. Entire population are subject to mandatory DNA and other biometric data collection. Monitoring apps are installed on every phone. Think of East German Stasi police state with cloud computing, artificial intelligence databases, and you will have a pretty good idea of the life of the Uyghurs today.
He said in the last few years alone, something like 2 million Uyghurs have been detained in these education transformational facilities. That's equivalent to around half the population of Norway, and it's the largest internment of an ethnic minority since World War II. And all of this, of course, is largely happening without the attention of the international community. China continues to be an attractive trade partner for many countries around the world. Their $1 trillion Belt and Road Initiative is allowing them to infiltrate country after country, and they're even exporting some of the technologies that they're using to track and control the Uyghur people to other places. So they've seen virtually no repercussions for the atrocities, and it's completely horrendous. We are starting to see, I think, a bit more coverage about it in the media. I've seen a few videos from BBC coming out about it. But until Oslo, I was unaware of the severity of the crisis there. And it's really shocking that there isn't more being done by our governments. And in the talk, Nuri Turkel was saying that the people in China can't do anything about this, because the censorship there means they're just unaware of the problem. And that means that it is on us in the international community to take a stance against it, to call upon our governments to stop supporting China, to call upon the companies that work within and with the Chinese state to do something about this. If you want to learn some more about this, obviously there's a link to the talk in the description below, but also put links to a podcast with Alex Gladstein from the Human Rights Foundation when he was on Marty Bent's podcast. And he talks a little bit about these same issues that are mentioned here and extends it in certain ways. And he even mentions how there are these rumours of organ harvesting from the prisoners there. And this is something that just last week, a commission came out and said, yes, there's sufficient evidence of organ harvesting taking place in these sorts of facilities. Following that talk, there was then another one talking about the troubles in Nicaragua, particularly highlighting the difficulties of staging non-violent protests. Nicaragua has obviously been a very troubled country for decades, and in the talk the presenter noted that any Nicaraguan over the age of about 40 has seen at least 2 armed conflicts in their lifetime. But he also said that there's a general sense among the younger populations that armed conflicts aren't the best way forwards. And there's a growing belief in non-violent protests to call for the removal of the country's dictator and to demand free and fair elections. So he highlighted this contrasting approach between the previous movements and today's.
The flag that they rose was the blue and white flag, and they were not talking about free homeland or death. They were talking about free homeland and life.
Of course, the government there isn't too happy with these protests, even if they are peaceful. And so they've reacted with violence against them.
A very conservative report of the International Commission on Human Rights from the Organization of American States estimated that at least 325 people had been killed. 2,000 people had been seriously injured, sexually abused, mutilated, tortured. More than 1,200 Nicaraguans, including journalists, including human rights defenders, had to go through the prisons of Nicaragua. And above and beyond that, 82,000 Nicaraguans since of May last year have been forced into exile.
And with these attacks against protesters continuing, with even children being shot at, it's difficult to maintain a non-violent approach, especially when the events aren't receiving much coverage in the international community to provide some leverage to the movement. Non-violent protests were also the theme of the next talk by Denise Ho, a musician from Hong Kong who has been an advocate for LGBTQ rights since 2012, and who was also a big supporter of the Umbrella movement in 2014. That's a non-violent pro-democracy movement that was reacting to China's increasing controls in the region that sapped away the freedoms of Hong Kongers. And we're seeing a replay of that taking place over the past few weeks there, so this is particularly relevant. Ho spoke a bit about the movement, and also about the repercussions she faced from it. Specifically, she was talking about how China had banned her from performing, and attempted to censor her from existence there. There was even pressure placed upon her Western sponsors and supporters to drop their sponsorship of her, which they all then did. Instead of crumbling under all of the pressure and the difficulties that she was facing, Ho has instead started crowdfunding her events, finding alternative ways around the restrictions that are imposed upon her. And she's even now launched her own record label to try and support other artists in the area. So she was a really brilliant presenter as well. The story was fascinating, and she also rounded it all off with a short musical performance. Following Denise Ho, American historian Timothy Snyder then took to the stage to talk about the importance of history, the importance of taking learnings from the past and applying them to today.
The enemies of the freedom are also the enemies of the future. And this is why, my friends, I think that history is so important. History is the thing that breaks the logjam. History says that facts are real and that we have to search for them. History says we're all in this together, every perspective matters and has to be understood. And history says time is moving in one direction, that we learn from the past about the limits in the present, but that once we learn about the limits of the present, we also learn the ways around, the ways through, the combinations that will get us into a better future.
He spoke about his concerns that truth and history are essentially being ignored or even wiped away, and also mentioned how democracy and freedom isn't the natural state of the world. It's something we very much need to continually work towards and fight for. And like everything covered in Oslo, it was a really superb presentation, this time leaning much closer to a TED Talk than some of the other things that were taking place there. And it looked at things on a bit of a higher level than many of the other talks. And that was something that was then carried through into the next talk by the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zaid Ra'ad Al Hussein, who basically spoke about the need to take a holistic view on human rights issues.
You see, fundamental freedoms, the freedom to opinion, the freedom to expression, to peaceful assembly, to association, they must be applied universally. They must be. If we don't do it, we will never have the density within the movement, the strength within the movement, to overcome the dangers that exist before us.
That then led into the final theatre session of the first day, which was a discussion on technology and the dangers associated with it between the former chess player and human rights activist Garry Kasparov and the information warfare expert Molly McHugh. And this was a really fascinating talk, very, very densely packed with information. And they touched on ideas such as the asymmetry in how the free and the unfree world are using technology at the moment, with the latter showing much more desire and organisation in the way that they use technology to undermine democracies and engage in harmful practices.
And unless, there's a political will, which is just is missing on the side of the free world, you cannot defend you, because defense in the cyber war is useless. It's a losing proposition. The only way to defend our interests, to defend the infrastructure of the free world, it's a deterrence. It's only a threat of retaliation. And so far, there's very little appetite among the public, and of course, there's no political will among the leaders of the free world to fight back.
They also talked a bit about the ethical responsibilities of major tech companies, who right now try to take a neutral stance on things, which means that they're supplying their technology to regimes that then use those to control and manipulate people.
I want them just to share responsibility for helping the enemies of the free world to advance their cause. Because it's with all these stories about, this is the big tech boom in China or elsewhere, they still need Western technologies. They still need the companies. They still need, Facebook, Google, Apple to be at least accomplices, if not co-conspirators in their plans. And again, unfortunately, then the business motive prevails. And while these companies are, they're registered in America or in Europe, so I mean, they don't want to share responsibility. They don't recognize that they are responsible for undermining the very foundation of the free world.
And one of the big things that Garry Kasparov mentioned was how the current situation is very reminiscent, or perhaps even an extension of the Cold War. But because there aren't physical signs of it, because there aren't massive walls representing the dividing ideologies, people are perhaps less willing to do anything about the challenges that we currently face. These kinds of themes also ran into the first of the afternoon's mesh sessions, or the first that I attended, which was called the Battle for the Internet, and it featured a really cool panel including Perry Chen, who was the creator of Kickstarter. Again, there was a lot of talk about responsibilities of companies, and Yuan Yang, the Financial Times Beijing correspondent, pointed out that there are contrasting ways that technological challenges of authoritarian regimes can be viewed. Specifically, she was talking about China's Great Firewall, and that could be looked at from a human perspective and seen as a horrendous overreach by a government to control and censor what their people can do. Or it can be looked at as a big money-making opportunity by a company like Cisco. Perry Chen then mentioned something that I thought was really interesting, because it was coming from a perspective you don't often hear from the Silicon Valley types who tend to be quite libertarian. And he was talking about Facebook crying out for regulation to be imposed upon them and their competitors to force them to take some responsibility in situations that involve perhaps supporting different regimes or counteracting fake news. The problem right now, he was saying, is that companies have a responsibility to their shareholders to make money. So if a CEO decides that they're going to forego some big profit opportunity because they fundamentally disagree with something, because they want to take a stance against that, they could just be forced out and replaced with somebody else who just puts money first. So potentially some kind of regulation coming in to level the playing field for all companies to ensure that shareholders know that some competitor won't snap up an opportunity that they overlook because they have some integrity could be beneficial. So that was a really interesting discussion. And it was then countered somewhat in the next of the mesh sessions, which was called Finance and Freedom and hosted by Laura Shin. This one featured a whole bunch of Bitcoin experts, including Jimmy Song, who I do find can be a bit hit and miss in these sorts of things. But in Oslo, I thought he was really on point. He was talking about how regulations, and any central party really are very much a double-edged sword. So in the previous session, we had somebody who was saying that regulators need to come in and solve various problems around the world. But here we had somebody saying we need to be very careful about how exactly they're doing things and what they are doing. Specifically, what Jimmy Song was saying was that if you allow anybody to come in and be a gatekeeper of content or of anything really, then that's fine so long as they are accurately representing your views and your beliefs. But what happens when they stop being so representative of you? Then you stop being so happy with their behaviour, and what was once moderation to remove undesirable things becomes censorship of legitimate views. One solution to that, of course, is to entirely remove any central parties from being gatekeepers in the first place. That's the very decentralised approach to this. And that means, yes, you can be exposed to undesirable things, but it also ensures that you're properly protected, your freedom is protected. Another solution, I suppose, is ensuring that there is sufficient separation of powers and there is sufficient accountability on those gatekeeping parties. But then if you think back to Timothy Snyder's points, then you can never guarantee that these separations of powers, these accountabilities, will actually last and protect people in the long run, because things can so easily slip back into being censorship again. So this is a really fascinating and nuanced conundrum, and it's something I think about quite often. And I believe over the next few years, we're all going to be thinking about it a lot more frequently. We're already seeing some issues with power players in, for example, YouTube, where they're trying to take actions that most people agree with, but even then it has these very unintended negative consequences on so many other people. Or we're seeing in the media with Julian Assange potentially being extradited for basically bringing truth to people. We're seeing in Australia journalists' homes and workplaces being raided. And it's likely these kinds of issues are going to continue increasing in the next few years. And it's going to become particularly important and relevant in discussions around money, especially as we move towards a world where all of our money is digital and where governments might have completely transparent views into our spending and may even be able to say who we can and cannot give money to. And so, of course, that brings us back to Bitcoin and back to Oslo, where they were saying how Bitcoin can be a solution against this kind of surveillance and censorship that we're seeing in places already like China. The panel also touched on some other really interesting things. They talked about the upcoming VAT regulations, which just a couple of weeks ago were properly announced. And Elena Vrananov from CASA also made some really interesting points about how in the past, where she grew up in, I think it was Czechoslovakia, there was a movement to create a kind of parallel world away from the government control because they were overreaching in so many areas of people's lives. But at the time, they were lacking a proper money that wasn't in government control. And nowadays, we have Bitcoin to do that. So all of that was a really fascinating discussion. And again, in the description below, I'll link to Laura Shin's podcast where the recording is. Following this, there was another Bitcoin-focused talk by the Open Money Initiative. That's Jill Carlson's project that's taking a very mature and considered approach to tackling economic and financial challenges in places like Venezuela. And they're actually studying what people are currently doing there and how they're doing things to see how Bitcoin can fit into people's lives and make them better. It's a really cool project, and it's infinitely better than the often very inconsiderate and kind of exploitative rhetoric that you see online about how Bitcoin can save everyone in Venezuela, where it seems like people are taking a very genuinely tragic situation and using it to try and shill cryptocurrency. However, in Oslo, I didn't get the chance to attend their talk because of the way that the mesh sessions are structured, where there are multiple things taking place at once. So instead of seeing them, I went to a different one on religious persecution in the Middle East. But again, I'll link down below to some podcasts that the Open Money Initiative were on, so you can learn about that if you're interested. At the session that I attended instead of that one, there were some really fascinating talks by people in situations that you really don't hear that much about, you don't think about that often. For example, there was a Palestinian man, but he was also a Christian, so he was very much in the minority in the country there. And he was talking about the kind of trouble that he and other Christians in the country face, explaining that one of his teachers, for example, refused to actually teach him at school because he wasn't part of, the correct religion. And all of that internal conflict there, all of that internal oppression is going on against the backdrop of the much larger conflict and oppression of the entire state. So you can imagine kind of the difficulties that people like him are facing there. So that was a really interesting insight into something you really don't hear that much about. And there was also a lady there who was Assyrian, and I didn't even realise that the Assyrians were really still a thing. You hear Assyrian and you think of the ancient empire. But she was saying, no, Assyrians, they're still about, but their numbers are rapidly dwindling because they're being assimilated in the western parts of their population. And in the east, they're being attacked and killed by people like ISIS. So they are now asking for a piece of land that they can call their own and actually live on in, relative peace. So again, really fascinating situation and something I want to learn more about because it's just a situation that you never really hear about normally. The final mesh session of the first day was another Bitcoin-related one, hosted this time by What Bitcoin Did's Peter McCormack. And like Laura Shin's session, this was all recorded, and I'll put a link to the podcast of it in the description below. It was all about Bitcoin's usage around the world and the legal situations that it faces in different countries. And it featured panelists from places like Hong Kong, the Philippines, Iran, India, and Nigeria. So a real range of different legal situations, from the heavy clampdowns in India to the sort of unclear but leaning on negative regulations in Iran and Nigeria, to the much more progressive stance of the Philippines. And despite these rather different outlooks from all of these different countries, there was a lot of commonality in the use cases that were mentioned, with remittances and other international payments coming up quite often, probably because Bitcoin is the best, international payment platform in the world. Day 2 opened with another fantastic TED-esque talk by a neuroscientist, and it also featured a very clever Cirque du Soleil performance to induce some awe. So you may wonder, why was this being brought up at a conference about human rights? And it's because awe and the neurological responses that it elicits in us can be a very powerful tool for anybody looking to influence or manipulate other people. And that's because awe at once makes people feel very small, but also part of and connected to something much larger.
So if you experience awe in nature, you have this remarkable, profound feeling of being connected with that nature. But awe can also be used to manipulate, right? To control. And we do this, for instance, through architecture. When people go into a cathedral, they feel a tremendous sense of awe. Their brain literally opens up. They're now ready to step forward into whatever message that is being presented. So awe can literally, and has been throughout history, used to weaponize, right? To manipulate. If you think about the huge military parades that even exist today, they're designed to create that sense of awe and wonder, to feel small but connected, to open your mind, to then be receptive to whatever message is now being presented.
But of course, as well as having all of these potential negative implications of using awe to manipulate people, it can also be used as a tool for good. And the speaker talked a bit about how he's investigating how artwork can be used to decrease feelings of intolerance among people.
So we've actually started a series of experiments to demonstrate that we can actually use awe induced by art to decrease people's perception of intolerance of difference, right? Not as a conclusion, but as a step forward to expansion.
The second talk was by Andrew Zolli of Planet Labs, and that's a company that creates and launches constellations of very compact satellites that are roughly the size of a loaf of bread. And he was talking about how this technology can be used to expose human rights abuses around the world. With this network of eyes in the sky, they can see everything going on day by day on Earth below, from deforestation to the creation and expansion of the Uyghur prison camps in China, to things like this.
Is the Tornillo detention facility on the border of the US and Mexico. This is when the current presidential administration in the United States said they were going to stop a policy of separating migrants' children from their parents. This is what it looked like a few months later, after they'd said they'd changed the policy.
So you can see how important and revolutionary this sort of thing can be in shifting the distribution of power in the world from the state to actual people. And finally, we have a way to keep tabs on the actions of vastly more powerful and better resourced entities who might not want us to know what is taking place. And this really incredible technology has various interesting benefits that you might not even expect. Things like tracking the production and flow of slave-harvested cocoa into the sanitized and fairly produced cocoa supply chain, and allowing action to be taken against that. And towards the end of the talk, Zolli mentioned how they're working heavily with the Human Rights Watch to see what needs to be built, to see what needs to be analysed, and he highlighted the work that they've done together in Myanmar to disprove the government lies about the destruction of Rohingya villages.
And what they're finding is this. So this is an example of something they produced. This is over 5 weeks at the beginning of 2018. This is the systematic demolition of Rohingya villages that the government claimed were a consequence of rampant fires that were occurring on the ground. As you can probably tell, there's no fires going on at all.
So that was a really awesome talk there. And it was followed up with Tae Yong-ho, the highest-ranking defector from North Korea, who had previously served as the ambassador for the countries all around the world in places like the UK. He started off talking a bit about the struggles of having essentially a kind of double life, of experiencing freedoms in the West and then returning to Korea. And he spoke about how he'd always be worried that his children would say things to their friends that they shouldn't, basically if they ever told the truth about their life here. And so he would get his sons to tell stories from Oliver Twist and pretend that was what life was like in London. It was this focus on his family that eventually forced him to defect from the country. It was his desire to give them a better life.
At last, I decided to break free because as a father, I think it is my last mission to cut the chain of slavery, because I thought that the life as a diplomat and the life of the children of diplomats of North Korea is nothing but the more than, the slavery. That is the main reason.
And you've defined...
He went on to talk a bit about North Korean life, about the big class divisions where some people are entitled to free housing and free healthcare and everything else, but many, many more suffer with virtually nothing. And he talked about how there isn't even freedom to be unemployed in the country, how everyone is simply appointed a job that they then have to serve. He then started talking about the slow shift in culture in North Korea, how young generations might be beginning to think a little bit more critically about life in the country as they're able to gain access to a bit more South Korean or American content, and about how activist activities to try and get more free world information into the country could really aid the development of the country and continue changing people's minds there. He says that there's still a very big fear of the government, and that's what's keeping people in place for now. He also firmly believes that the time is limited for the Kim regime.
I'm absolutely sure that Kim Jong-un regime cannot go on another 20 years. Of course, 10 years is too short, but I think within 20 years, there will be a collapse.
Then from North Korea to Somalia, where a Somali rights activist took to the stage to talk about the work that she's doing to promote peace, women's rights, and to rehabilitate child soldiers in the country. She ran an organisation called Elman Center, named after her husband, who was working on a very similar thing back in the 90s before he was killed by warlords. And once she returned to the country after having to flee because of his death, she continued to speak up for women who were suffering from sexual violence, a problem that's very taboo in the country, and also continued a program that they had begun back in the 90s called Drop the Gun, Pick Up the Pen, that tries to provide work for young people that isn't violent, and they've done a really good job of finding employment for many young people in Somalia.
We're the only organization who has been doing this work for many years, and seeing that the change in Somalia, and working to the peace through the local community. It is a lot of risk involved, but that is the work we chose to do it. And you can see the change when you are working. And Somalia will change, and we go into the Gara peace, but always Elman legacy is going to be there.
So that was some really stunning and brave work there. We then had a talk on Burma and the tragedy that they've suffered there, being a country that was so close to democracy and freedom not that long ago, to now being betrayed by a government that could have done so much good. This was presented by Etsa Hutsan, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist from the country who was forced to flee because she refused to bow to the pressure of the censors. Of course, she isn't the only person in Burma that has been forced out of the country, with some 723,000 Rohingyas having fled to Bangladesh, and around 10,000 having been killed in an escalation of violence and discrimination against minorities. Hutsan discussed how she grew up under the control of the military government, who prevented any criticism of them, or even any mention of fighting across the country. And when they finally transitioned to the opposition civilian government, everyone thought that they were guaranteed new freedoms, where the press could speak the truth. But instead, hundreds of people have been arrested for criticising the government, and 35 journalists have been arrested since 2013. And not only this, but the government has straight up lied to journalists about the events taking place in the country. When she was taken to a Rohingya village that the government claimed had been burnt down by the villagers themselves, this is what happened.
As we interviewed a couple of villagers, we suddenly realized that these villagers were the same people from the photograph given to us. They even wore the exact same clothes on that day as it appeared on the photos. They were not Rohingya. It was clear that the photographs given to the journalists by the local authorities were staged. I reported about the incident and also the plight of other ethnic minority groups. I told the truth about what really happened and how the military and the government tried to cover it up. Then I started getting death threats on social media and legal threats from the authorities.
And finally, she rounded it off with yet another message about the precariousness of freedom and democracy in the world.
We thought Burma was making progress, but now millions of people are living in fear again. Freedom, democracy, equality, and human rights are again sensitive topics. Everything that's happening right now in Burma, it's so similar to what we endured during the military dictatorship. This is not real freedom or democracy that Burma wanted. Crimes against humanity and democracy cannot coexist. What is happening in Burma is a lesson for all of us who want to see democracy in our countries. Democracy can pave the way for human rights and freedom. It is not inevitable or easy. But if we want democracy, we need to remain committed to its ideals and ensure freedom for all equally.
Next up was the first mentioning of sports at these talks, and I looked at the slavery that is going into building Qatar's World Cup infrastructure. Pete Patterson, a photographer and journalist, talked about how Qatar, the richest country in the world per capita, attracts thousands of migrant workers from poorer countries like India. So he first mentioned that there can be genuine success stories there, but many workers face exploitation, severe health problems, and even death in their search for work. Here's a look at the kind of accommodation that is provided to the migrant workers headed to Qatar.
त्यही हो प्रब्लम भनेको त्यही हो यहाँ हाम्रो अब त्यो टयलेट बाथरुम हेर्दाखेरि त्यस्तै छ केही त्यसको सफाइ छैन हैन सब उस्तै छ यहाँ भाडा एक रुममा चाहिँ 12 जना मान्छे हालेछ हैन 2 वर्ष भएको हामीले बेडै सिट दिए हैन भन्छ आफै किनेर ल्याऊ.
In this camp, over 600 men share just 2 kitchens.
किचन भन्नुहुन्छ भने तपाईहरु गरे हेर्न सक्दैछन् त्यहाँ यति मच्छरहरु र यति सांगलाहरु कीटाणुहरु झिंगाहरु त्यहाँ भन्क्या हुन्छ त्यो झिंगा खानामा बसिन्छ त्यही कारणले मान्छे नि बिमार हुन्छ.
And all of this squalor and hard work is compensated by as little as 75 cents per hour. And there are 4 reasons for this quasi-slavery that he highlighted. High recruitment fees to even find a job in the first place, fraudulent contracts that offer different terms at the last moment, the confiscation of people's passports when they enter the country, and a sponsorship system called kafala that places workers under the ownership of their sponsor essentially, meaning that they can't leave their jobs or the country without the permission of their sponsor. Qatar has started to react, but it's been slow and minimal, slightly reducing exploitation of kafala by allowing workers to leave the country and introducing a minimum wage that is still low, especially when considering the amount of money Qatar actually has. But much still remains the same there.
The labour camps I documented in 2013 still look the same in 2018. The deaths I reported on in 2013 are still happening today. But I'm also hopeful. I believe in the power of journalism. I believe that when people come together, journalists, activists, workers, football fans, things can change.
He was then followed up with a Cuban lawyer and journalist and human rights defender who has set up a non-profit organisation in the country to provide legal assistance to Cubans. She talked about the country's political system, where there is no separation of powers, where there is only a single party, and no chance for independents to run in elections. And this rigid and unrepresentative system puts in place laws that just don't make sense for Cubans, effectively restricting them from their own economy and preventing lawyers like herself from actually representing people against the state. So she started Cubalex to provide legal counsel for free to thousands of Cubans, educating people about the legal system and issuing reports about human rights abuses. But she's faced a lot of resistance from the government, who have raided her offices, confiscated the equipment, and forced her from the country. And in her absence, the country has fallen further into human rights abuse, with thousands of activists detained arbitrarily for protesting against the state, even if they're doing that peacefully. And so she's calling for other countries to recognise parties like hers as legitimate opposition, so that hopefully they can get power and start making corrective changes that are so desperately needed there. There was then another talk in a country you just don't hear that much about, and that was Tajikistan. And this was done by a man called Sharadin Gadoev, an exiled opposition leader who was actually kidnapped in Moscow earlier this year. He explained how the dictator who rules his country has placed his family in control of 80% of the economy there, and how anyone trying to take a stand against the dictator is viciously attacked in response. Gadoev and his cousin decided to form an opposition party to try and promote freedom and human rights, and that obviously sparked a response from the government, who first threatened them with imprisonment and then death. Gadoev fled the country, but was placed on Interpol's wanted list in 2013. Meanwhile, his cousin was murdered in front of his family by the Tajik intelligence forces, and his other relatives have also been openly attacked in the country. Eventually, as I said, he was kidnapped in Russia as part of a plan that was approved both by Russian and Tajik governments, and he was then forced to record videos saying he would voluntarily return to his country, and he was somehow able to make it out of all of this alive because of the international pressures placed upon Tajikistan. Of course, that kind of response is rare, and many others still suffer under the corrupt and brutal regime. But he highlighted how he was proof that international cooperation against the state works, and that there is a way to drive Tajikistan towards a better future.
I am a living proof that your voice has power, and that someone will listen. Only together, in solidarity, and only using peaceful, democratic means, we will achieve a transformation where human life and freedom become core values in Tajikistan. Thank you.
And like the first day, the final theatre session was another discussion, this time focusing on creating an international system to achieve justice for those that are oppressed and assaulted by authoritarian regimes. Primarily, this was a talk by Bill Browder, who has taken a stance against Russia for many years, and whose lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, died in Russian custody after months of imprisonment and torture. It was that death that drove Browder to forge what was initially a US law called the Magnitsky Act, which has now been adopted in 6 countries. And this sanctions individuals found to be complicit in politically sanctioned murders. Here is him talking about the kind of inspiration that he had behind it.
And I discovered that if a crime is committed in one country, like that, and the authorities in that country want to cover it up, there's effectively no mechanisms to get justice. And for me, that was an unacceptable thought, that Putin and his cronies could absolutely get away with murder. And I thought that I just can't live with myself if that's what's going to happen. And then I said to myself, okay, there's no jurisdiction for murder in Russia that you can prosecute in New York, but all these guys, the ones who killed Sergei Magnitsky for sure, and many others, they do this stuff for money. In Sergei's case, he exposed $230 million crime and did it for money. And I said, we can take that money, we can freeze that money in the West and we can ban their visas. And that became known as the Magnitsky Act.
At present, he's trying to get the Magnitsky Act pushed through the EU, But that's been very difficult because of the requirements of the EU to have complete consensus among all participating countries, and Turkey is too close to Putin to ever allow that to happen. So instead, he's having to go country by country across Europe to restrict the movement of money of powerful state-level criminals. Of course, this is a very interesting thing to consider, coming from the perspective of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, because it's very easy to imagine all of these terrible dictators and murderers just pivoting to Bitcoin if all of the traditional payment rails are blocked by Magnitsky Acts. And that brings us kind of back to this question around gatekeepers and central players. With those in place, yes, you can stop all of these dictators from moving their money around, but also they are able to place restrictions on their people. At least with Bitcoin, yes, the murderers, the dictators, whoever, they can move their money around with Bitcoin. But it also means that the people that they are oppressing can do that as well. Back to Oslo though, and like on the first day, the afternoon was taken up with mesh sessions, this time beginning with one on Saudi phone hacking. Obviously this touched on the Jeff Bezos stuff, but it also talked about, again, the responsibilities of companies, with Israel's NSO group talked about because they are the ones that created this Pegasus spyware that has been used by Saudi Arabia to capture information on journalists and activists and anyone else that they feel threatens their power. And while there was a lot mentioned here that I thought was really fascinating and often quite terrifying when they're talking about the capabilities of the software being used, the thing that really stuck with me was when the discussion really turned to the realities that journalists and others face when trying to protect themselves from state surveillance. Economically, it's almost infeasible for anyone to maintain best practices, especially if you're not backed by a major media company. They need to stay up to date with the latest hardware, have multiple phones that they can use in different situations, keep up to date with software updates, use VPNs and other privacy tools, and even then, they're probably still exposed through the unprotected devices of family members and friends. So to have any real chance of successfully evading the eyes of the government, you either need to be a hermit or do all of those things for every single person in your life. And for journalists, this kind of stuff isn't just necessary to protect their work and privacy, but they're conscious that any failure to protect themselves properly could expose their sources, and that could potentially cost people their lives. And a lot of what they said is quite obvious when you think about it, but it's not till you hear about it all laid out like that it becomes real. After this, there was another session with Tae Yong-ho, and again he covered a lot of similar points to in his theatre session, but also expanded on it on a number of interesting ways. One of the things he was talking about was the difficulty North Korea faces in trying to modernise and enhance economic activity, which often involves cooperating with others outside of the country. And right now they're using a kind of hybrid approach where certain areas are established that are a bit freer, a bit more perhaps recognisable to us in the West. But to prevent the North Korean workers there getting too carried away with all of that, they very much separate these areas out. They will ship in all of the workers at the start of the day and take them all home again at the end of the day, just to limit their interactions with the real world as much as possible. There's also an issue with the way that these workers get paid, with foreign money going first to Kim Jong-un and eventually filtering its way back down to the workers. And that's very troubling, but it's difficult to find a better solution to this, because if the workers were actually given the money on their way out, then they'd probably just be stopped and have it taken off of them by the government anyway. Yong-ho also spoke a bit about the way that children are forced into labour during school, and even worse, some of them are made for months on end to practice gymnastics for shows that Western tourists then come and watch. And he said that there are actually companies in Europe that advertise these gymnastics shows and try and get people to them. And so he called for an end to that, so that we can try and take at least a bit of a stand against this kind of practice. The final session of the day that I went to was another crypto-related talk, this time featuring Brock Pierce. And to be honest, I thought this was easily the worst event of the entire 3-day session. And I did wonder if perhaps it's my bias coming in because I'm not really a big Brock Pierce fan, but even afterwards speaking about it with my girlfriend who has no idea who Brock Pierce is, she also didn't think it was particularly good either. And really the trouble was that there just wasn't much clarity around what he was talking about. The conversation just sort of went all over the place, and the only real point that he made that you could take away was decentralization is good. It was kind of like travelling back to 2017 or early 18, where we were all very carried away with everything and people were screaming decentralise the world with no deeper thought or actual meaning. And I thought we had all taken some time to kind of rationalise and find a more nuanced view of things. I think perhaps his viewpoint might be that there is potentially a number of interesting applications of what we might call decentralised technologies, and that we might as well experiment with it to see what's viable and what isn't, what's useful and what isn't, and what brings genuine benefits to people, because, as we were saying earlier, there's all these problems when you do put central parties in. But if that's what he was saying, and I do largely agree with that, he didn't particularly articulate that very well. And in a room that was largely filled with people who didn't know much about Bitcoin, it was way too generalized and wishy-washy, I think, for people to really take anything away from that was useful. Day 3 was a shortened day with no mesh sessions in the afternoon, but there was still a full morning of theatre sessions, which began with a talk on child marriage in Malawi. This was something that's very common in Malawi, with 10% of girls married before 15 and 42% married before 18. And there's a number of reasons for this, as the anti-child marriage advocate Mary Mwe laid out. These reasons include things like poverty, which forces parents to get rid of their children to lessen the economic burden on themselves. But it's also because they believe they can have a better life if they're married, and also because of a lack of awareness about child rights. And even worse, these factors also allow for gender-based violence to take place against these child brides, who feel that they have nowhere to turn to and no home to return to, and so they face a devastating loss of income if they leave their husbands. Memory Mabwe has been working to change things, using education to combat these problems, and eventually her work has led her to coming onto a radio show and then getting her own entire show to continue pushing her message. It was really inspiring to hear how she's managed to help people already with her work.
I am glad that there are positive changes that are coming through. Like now we have children that are abandoning their marriages and returning to school. We have young mothers beginning support groups for themselves. We have victims now opening up to learn income generating skills. We have women coming forward to report gender-based violence. And of course, we have children and young people knowing of their rights and responsibilities. And sometimes they send us advocacy materials so that we can use, these are things that they have been able to come up with from the skills and the talents that they have. So they send songs or poems, paintings, and etc., so that they can help in the fight to improve the lives of other young people.
But as she says, there's a lot more work to do in the country to rid it of child marriages, but there are positive changes that are already coming through. Child marriages have been outlawed since 2015, and I was reading that the message is also being promoted by Malawi's First Lady, so it seems like there is some real hope there. There was then a really, really powerful and inspirational talk from an Afghan woman who is working to combat drug problems in her country. Obviously, Afghanistan has faced a lot of issues with war and with religious fundamentalism, but they've overshadowed this epic drug crisis where more than 12% of the population use drugs, including the speaker's brother. And here's her explaining the sort of conditions that some of these addicts live in.
Under the bridge was filthy. The water starting from baths and toilets poured here. Addicts washed and bathed themselves in this dirty water. Amongst the heaps of garbage, they looked in the search. They searched for a morsel of food as one obsessed by searching for diamonds. And if nothing that could be eaten, if anything couldn't be eaten, they would burn it to keep themselves warm. My eyes were open to a hell on earth.
While she was treating her brother, she learned of the full extent of the issue and decided that she needed to do something about it because the government didn't care much and the public just view addicts as criminals. So she established Mother Camp, a private rehabilitation centre from which she's treated something like 5,000 Afghans. And while perhaps 20 to 25% of these people actually do recover, some of those that do recover go on to create their own rehabilitation centres to help other people, or will assist her at Mother Camp, or work in her cafe, which is used to fund her programme. And after speaking a bit about her work, she explained further the situation that many of these addicts come from, and how drug problems are heavily tied with other major problems in the country. For example, a lot of the opium users will be former soldiers or young people who have used it to escape from the world of war around them, while many of the female addicts, which make up about a third of the overall drug-using population, suffer from sexual violence and exploitation from their suppliers. She ended her talk calling for a support for women during peace talks with the Taliban, and asked that the international community be a voice for women during these talks, and also ended things with a bit of a hopeful message.
But caring, compassion, and empowerment can be powerful tools in dealing with the consequences of war. Giving someone a job, providing them access to medical care, giving them some tough love, these can bring about huge changes. When we refuse to let the victims of war be forgotten, when we are able to support one another, then we can make a big change in the world.
Next up was Brian Fogel, the director of the Oscar-winning Icarus documentary about the Russian doping scandal, with a particular focus on Grigory Rodchenkov, who was the man at the helm of that doping scheme. The first half of his talk was all about the doping itself and the story of how Fogel ended up in contact with and becoming friends with Rodchenkov, and that was all really fascinating and all very covered if you've seen the film. But what really connected this to the rest of the Freedom Forum sessions was the second part of his talk, which focused much more on the cost and the consequences of being a whistleblower. For example, one of Gregory's friends, who had played an important role in the state-run doping scheme, showed up dead just before speaking to a journalist about what had taken place.
After he went for a run, this guy had never had a heart problem. He had never been to a doctor. He had never had anything wrong with him. And 2 days before his death, he called up Gregory and told Gregory that he had a meeting with David Walsh, the world-famous sports journalist of the Sunday Times in London, and that he was going to tell David Walsh the story of what had happened. So clearly Russia was monitoring his phones and decided to kill him before he could speak to David Walsh.
Gregory has, for now, remained unharmed by Russia. But here's the extreme lengths that he has to go to remain safe.
This is Gregory, his daily life. If he ever goes out, he's under armed guards with AK or semi-automatic guns, wearing a bulletproof vest. He lives in 24/7 isolation under security, under the protection of the U.S. government, because Russia has made it clear that they want to kill him.
And it's believed that 2 of the 9 Russian agents expelled from the US a little while ago were actually there to hunt him down. Russia has also tried to ruin his chances of claiming asylum in the country by charging him with drug smuggling, which immediately makes somebody ineligible for asylum. So here we have a whistleblower, somebody trying to reveal truth in a murky world, destined to spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, living in fear, and requiring teams of armed men to walk him lest he be attacked by Russia. And Russia, who we know were responsible for a massive doping campaign that went all the way to the top, continue with little repercussion, and are even able to overturn, case by case, the penalties that have been handed down to their athletes. And it's frustrating, and the talk goes very nicely with the previous day's talk about Saudi phone hacking, to really understand the cost and the difficulties associated with standing up for the truth in the world. And it's more evidence backing these ideas that we've heard repeatedly throughout the talks, that fairness and democracy isn't the natural state of the world. It's something we need to work for constantly, and we cannot be complacent about it, because there are bad actors who are working tirelessly to destabilize everything that we have. There was then a talk by a transgender activist from Kenya who spoke a bit about her transition and how it cost her everything, including relationships with her family and her employment, but also about how she's now established an advocacy group to promote transgender rights. And she shared some really shocking statistics about suicide rates, for example, among the transgender community.
We face numerous challenges, such as stigma, high levels of violence, discrimination, and health issues.
We then stayed in the continent of Africa for the next talk, where a man from Cameroon took to the stage to talk about cultural tensions in his country between the Francophone and Anglophone populations, and how he has become labelled as a terrorist because he led peaceful protests against the marginalisation and suppression of his Anglophone community. He explained how over the past few decades, life in Cameroon has shifted further and further in favour of the Francophone majority, from relatively minor things at the beginning, like adjusting the flag and the name of the country, to not accounting for English-speaking students in some schools, to the eventual killings and arrests of Anglophones. He also touched on the difficulties in coming to terms with the idea of working with Francophones to try and overcome the difficulties that we are seeing in his country. And he's now seen that cooperation is the best way forwards, even while people on both sides of the division seem to disagree with this. The final talk of the entire event was another Saudi-focused session, this time looking at women's rights. And the presenter here was a man whose sister was an activist in the country, who campaigned for the right to drive, and who was one of a number of women to be arrested and imprisoned and tortured because they've taken a stance against the government. Here are some of the things that she's been charged with.
So these are the charges, actually, that Lujain is facing. Contacting human rights organizations, contacting foreign journalists, contacting diplomats, and even applying for a job at the United Nations. These are not jokes, by the way. These are official charges.
After his speech, a pair of Human Rights Foundation activists came to the stage to talk about the campaign that they had run to bring more attention to these kinds of issues, they called the Freedom Drive, where they had driven across America and ended in a protest outside the Saudi embassy. And actually, throughout this protest that they were doing, a few women were actually released from prison in Saudi Arabia. So there were some real tangible benefits and results from it. And that really brought to an end the entire event. There were a few other bits, some award-giving ceremonies and things like that. But overall, I thought this was a really incredible and inspiring and superlative event that I would definitely recommend anybody goes to just to learn some of the things that are taking place. And I know that they're running some regional events as well around the world, as well as the main session in Norway. So there are things coming up in Taiwan and America and Mexico, I believe. And I think this aspect of Bitcoin, how it intersects with these human rights issues, is something that's really important to cover. And I don't think it gets enough publicity, because even at the event, when in the sessions that were focused on Bitcoin, when speakers would say, who here has heard of Bitcoin, who here owns it, most people had heard of Bitcoin, but a surprisingly low number of people actually owned it. And this was in sessions that were focused on Bitcoin, so probably attracting a decent chunk of the audience who would already be familiar with and kind of into that sort of thing. And also it's a group of people who can really benefit from using it. These activists, people who would be able to transmit money much easier between different countries into hard to reach places, who might be trying to evade some of these sanctions imposed upon them by these sort of corrupt governments. So you really get the sense that this narrative of Bitcoin as this tool for freedom is something we really need to push a lot more as a community, because it's so important. And definitely, I've spent a lot of time over the last year or so really thinking a lot about what I do on this channel and the things that I've been making, and I've been disappointed in myself for a lot of different ways, and I want to make a lot of different changes. But chief among those is this kind of thing about bringing it back to these much more meaningful and important topics. It doesn't need to be all the time, but at least, every so often. I think it's so important just to put aside all of this stuff about like the price and just say, like, what are we doing? What is this for? What are the benefits? How can this really improve people's lives? Because that is what matters most. So anyway, I hope you found this really interesting. I know this event for me was absolutely fascinating and really has made me think about a lot of things very differently and made me aware of so many things that I wasn't before. And I definitely hope to attend more of their things in the future, and hopefully I'll be able to contribute more in the future as well. Because you do kind of feel a bit useless walking around and there's all these just absolutely amazing people there who are doing so many positive things for the world. But yes, hopefully this was interesting and made a nice break from all of the other videos that are going on about people screaming about Bitcoin at $10,000 or $12,000 or whatever and talking about Libra and all that. And also apologies for how delayed this was. This specific video is supposed to be out about, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks ago, but just about everything that can go wrong filming one of these has gone wrong. I've had to redo it about 3 times and I'm this close to just giving up on it. But I think this stuff matters so much and it's so important to talk about it. So yes, thank you so much for watching. This is probably very long, especially because I need to put in all the extra bits. So thank you for sticking with it if you have. I will see you in the next video. Take care.